Colonial Brazil comprises the period from 1500, with the arrival of the Portuguese, until 1815, when Brazil was elevated to a kingdom in union with Portugal as the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil and the Algarves. During the early 300 years of Brazilian colonial history, the economic exploitation of the territory was based first on brazilwood extraction, sugar production, and finally on gold and diamond mining. Slaves, especially those brought from Africa, provided most of the working force of the Brazilian export economy after a brief period of Indian slavery to cut brazilwood. In contrast to the neighboring Spanish possessions, which had several viceroyalties with jurisdiction initially over New Spain and Peru, and in the 18th century expanded to viceroyalties of Rio de la Plata and New Granada, the Portuguese colony of Brazil was settled mainly in the coastal area by the Portuguese and a large black slave population working sugar, plantations and mines. The boom and bust economic cycles were linked to export products. Brazil's sugar age, with the development of plantation slavery, merchants serving as middlemen between production sites, Brazilian ports, and Europe, was undermined by the growth of the sugar industry in the Caribbean on islands that European powers seized from Spain. Gold and diamonds were discovered and mined in southern Brazil through the end of the colonial era. Brazilian cities were largely port cities, and the colonial administrative capital was moved several times in response to the rise and fall of export products' importance. Unlike Spanish America that fragmented in many republics, Brazil remained as a single administrative unit with a monarch, giving rise to the largest country in Latin America. Like Spanish America with Castilian Spanish, Brazil had linguistic integrity of Portuguese. Both Spanish America and Brazil were Roman Catholic. Discovery and early colonial history. Portugal and Spain pioneered the European charting of sea routes that were the first and only channels of interaction between all of the world's continents, thus beginning the process of globalization. In addition to the imperial and economic undertaking of discovery and colonization of far-off lands, these years were filled with pronounced advancements in cartography, shipbuilding and navigational instruments, of which the Portuguese and Spanish explorers took advantage. In 1494, the two kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula divided the New World between them, and in 1500 navigator Pedro Alvarez Cabral landed in what is now Brazil and laid claim to it in the name of King Manuel I of Portugal. The Portuguese identified brazilwood as a valuable red dye and an exploitable product, and attempted to force indigenous groups in Brazil to cut the trees. The age of exploration. The Portuguese were a seafaring part of the Iberian Peninsula, and in the early 15th century, Portugal began its expansion from a small area of the peninsula to seizing the Muslim fortress of Ceuta in North Africa. Its maritime exploration then proceeded down the coast of West Africa and across the Indian Ocean to the South Asian subcontinent as well as the Atlantic islands off the coast of Africa. They sought the sources of gold, ivory, and African slaves that were high-value goods of the African trade. The Portuguese set up fortified trading factories, whereby permanent, fairly small commercial settlements anchored trade in a region. The initial costs of setting up these commercial posts was borne by private investor, who in turn received hereditary titles and commercial advantages. For the Portuguese crown's point of view, its realm was expanded with relatively little cost to itself. On the Atlantic islands of the Azores, Madeira, and São Tomé, the Portuguese began plantation production of sugarcane using forced labor, a precedent for Brazil's sugar production in the 16th and 17th centuries. The Portuguese discovery of Brazil Brazil was preceded by a series of treaties between the kings of Portugal and Castile, following Portuguese sailings down the coast of Africa to India and the voyages to the Caribbean of Genoese mariner sailing for Castile, Christopher Columbus. The most decisive of these treaties was the Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494, that created the Tordesillas meridian, dividing the world between those two kingdoms. All land discovered or to be discovered east of that meridian was to be the property of Portugal, and everything to the west of it went to Spain. The Tordesillas meridian divided South America into two parts, leaving a large chunk of land to be exploited by the Spaniards. The Treaty of Tordesillas was arguably the most decisive event in all Brazilian history, since it alone determined that a portion of South America would be settled by Portugal instead of Spain. The present extent of Brazil's coastline is almost exactly that defined by the Treaty of Madrid, which was approved in 1750. Discovery and early exploitation. On April 22, 1500, during the reign of King Manuel I, a fleet led by navigator Pedro Álvares Cabral landed in Brazil and took possession of the land in the name of the king, although it is debated whether previous Portuguese explorers had already been in Brazil. This date is widely and politically accepted as the day of the discovery of Brazil by Europeans. Álvares Cabral was leading a large fleet of 13 ships and more than 1,000 men following Vasco da Gama's way to India, around Africa. The place where Álvares Cabral arrived is now known as Porto Seguro, in northeastern Brazil. After the voyage of Álvares Cabral, the Portuguese concentrated their efforts on the lucrative possessions in Africa and India and showed little interest in Brazil. Between 1500 and 1530, relatively few Portuguese expeditions came to the new land to chart the coast and to obtain Brazil wood. In Europe, this wood was used to produce a valuable dye to give color to luxury textiles. To extract Brazil wood from the tropical rainforest, the Portuguese and other Europeans relied on the work of the natives, who were initially worked in exchange for European goods like mirrors, scissors, knives and axes. In this early stage of the colonization of Brazil, and also later, the Portuguese frequently relied on the help of Europeans who lived together with the indigenous peoples and knew the languages and culture. The most famous of these were the Portuguese João Ramalho, who lived among the Guaianás tribe near today's São Paulo, and Diogo Álvares Correa, nicknamed Caramuru, who lived among the Tupinamba natives near today's Salvador da Bahia. Over time, the Portuguese realized that some European countries, especially France, were also sending excursions to the land to extract Brazil wood. Worried about foreign incursions and hoping to find mineral riche, the Portuguese crown decided to send large missions to take possession of the land and combat the French. In 1530, an expedition led by Martim Afonso de Souza arrived in Brazil to patrol the entire coast, ban the French, and create the first colonial villages like São Vicente on the coast. Structure of colonization. At first Brazil was set up as 15 private, hereditary captaincies. Pernambuco succeeded by growing sugarcane. São Vicente prospered by dealing in indigenous slaves. The other 13 captaincies failed, leading the king to make colonization a royal effort rather than a private one. In 1549, Tomé de Souza sailed to Brazil to establish a central government. De Souza brought along Jesuits, who set up missions, saved many natives from slavery, studied native languages, and converted many natives natives to Roman Catholicism. The Jesuits worked to pacify a hostile tribe, helped the Portuguese expel the French from a colony they had established at present-day Rio de Janeiro. Captaincies. The first attempt to colonize Brazil followed the system of hereditary captaincies, which had previously been used successfully in the colonization of Madeira Island. The costs were transferred to private hands, saving the Portuguese crown from the high costs of colonization. Thus, between 1534 and 1536, King John III divided the land into 15 captaincy colonies, which were given to Portuguese noblemen who wanted and had the means to administer and explore them. The captains were granted ample powers to administer and profit from the possessions. For the 15 original captaincies, only 2, Pernambuco and São Vicente, prospered. The failure of most captaincies was related to the resistance of the indigenous peoples, shipwrecks and internal disputes between the colonizers. Pernambuco, the most successful captaincy, belonged to Duarte Coelho, who founded the city of Olinda in 1536. His captaincy prospered with sugarcane mills used to produce sugar, which were installed after 1542. Sugar was a very valuable good in Europe, and its production became the main Brazilian colonial produce for the next 150 years. The captaincy of São Vicente, owned by Martim Afonso de Souza, also produced sugar, but its main economic activity was the traffic of indigenous slaves. Governors-general. With the failure of most captaincies and the menacing presence of French ships along the Brazilian coast, the government of King John III decided to turn the colonization of Brazil back into a royal enterprise. In 1549, a large fleet led by Tomé de Souza set sail to Brazil to establish a central government in the colony. Tomé de Souza, the first Governor-General of Brazil, brought detailed instructions, prepared by the king's aides, about how to administer and foster the development of the colony. His first act was the foundation of the capital city, Salvador da Bahia, in northeastern Brazil, in today's state of Bahia. The city was built on a slope by a bay and was divided into an upper administrative area and a lower commercial area with a harbour. Tomé de Souza also visited the captaincies to repair the villages and reorganize their economies. In 1551, the Diocese of São Salvador da Bahia was established in the colony, with its seat in Salvador. The second Governor-General, Duarte da Costa, faced conflicts with the indigenous peoples and severe disputes with other colonizers and the bishop. Wars against the natives around Salvador consumed much of his government. The fact that the first bishop of Brazil, Pero Fernandes Sardina, was killed and eaten by the Caeté natives after a shipwreck in 1556 illustrates how strained the situation was between the Portuguese and many indigenous tribes. The third Governor-General of Brazil was Mem de Sá. He was an efficient administrator who managed to defeat the indigenous peoples and, with the help of the Jesuits, expel the French from the colony of France Antarctique. As part of this process, his nephew, Estácio de Sá, founded the city of Rio de Janeiro there in 1565. The huge size of Brazil led to the colony being divided in two after 1621, when King Philip II created the States of Brazil, with Salvador as capital, and Maranhão, with its capital in São Luís. The state of Maranhão was still further divided in 1737 into the Maranhão e Piauí and Grão-Pará e Rio Negro, with its capital in Belém de Pará. Each state had its own governor. After 1640, the governors of Brazil coming from the high nobility started to use the title of viceroy. In 1763, the capital of the Estado de Brazil was transferred from Salvador to Rio de Janeiro. In 1775 all Brazilian estados were unified into the Viceroyalty of Brazil, with Rio de Janeiro as capital, and the title of the king's representative was officially changed to that of Viceroy of Brazil. As in Portugal, each colonial village and city had a city council, whose members were prominent figures of colonial society. Colonial city councils were responsible for regulating commerce, public infrastructure, professional artisans, prisons, etc. Jesuit Missions. Tomé de Souza, first Governor-General of Brazil, brought the first group of Jesuits to the colony. More than any other religious order, the Jesuits represented the spiritual side of the enterprise and were destined to play a central role in the colonial history of Brazil. The spreading of the Catholic faith was an important justification for the Portuguese conquests, and the Jesuits were officially supported by the king, who instructed Tomé de Souza to give them all the support needed to Christianize the indigenous peoples. The first Jesuits, guided by Father Manuel da Nobrega and including prominent figures like Juan de Espilcueta Navarro, Leonardo Nunes and later José de Anchieta, established the first Jesuit missions in Salvador and in São Paulo dos Campos de Piratininga, the settlement that gave rise to the city of São Paulo. Nobrega and Anchieta were instrumental in the defeat of the French colonists of France Antarctique by managing to pacify the Tamoio natives, who had previously fought the Portuguese. The Jesuits took part in the foundation of the city of Rio de Janeiro in 1565. The success of the Jesuits in converting the indigenous peoples to Catholicism is linked to the capacity to understand the native culture, especially the language. The first grammar of the Tupi language was compiled by José de Anchieta and printed in Coimbra in 1595. The Jesuits often gathered the Aborigines in communities where the natives worked for the community and were evangelized. The Jesuits had frequent disputes with other colonists who wanted to enslave the natives. The action of the Jesuits saved many natives from slavery, but also disturbed their ancestral way of life and inadvertently helped spread infectious diseases against which the Aborigines had no natural defenses. Slave labor and trade were essential for the economy of Brazil and other American colonies, and the Jesuits usually did not object to the enslavement of African peoples. French incursions. The potential riches of tropical Brazil led the French, who did not recognize the Tordesillas Treaty that divided the world between the Spanish and the Portuguese, to attempt to colonize parts of Brazil. In 1555, the Nicolas Durand de Vilgagnon founded a settlement within Guanabara Bay, in an island in front of today's Rio de Janeiro. The colony, named France Antarctique, led to conflict with Governor-General Mem de Sa, who waged war against the colony in 1560. Estacio de Sa, nephew of the governor, founded Rio de Janeiro in 1565 and managed to expel the last French settlers in 1567. Jesuit priests Manuel da Nobrega and José de Anchieta were instrumental in the Portuguese victory by pacifying the natives who supported the French. Another French colony, France Equinoxial, was founded in 1612 in present-day São Luís, in the north of Brazil. In 1614 the French were again expelled from São Luís by the Portuguese. The Sugar Age. Since the initial attempts to find gold and silver failed, the Portuguese colonists adopted an economy based on the production of agricultural goods that were to be exported to Europe. Tobacco and cotton and some other agricultural goods were produced, but sugar became by far the most important Brazilian colonial product until the early 18th century. The first sugarcane farms were established in the mid-16th century and were the key for the success of the captaincies of São Vicente Oriente and Pernambuco, leading sugarcane plantations to quickly spread to other coastal areas in colonial Brazil. Initially, the Portuguese attempted to utilize Indian slaves for sugar cultivation, but shifted to the use of black African slave labor. The period of sugar-based economy is known as the Sugar Age in Brazil. The development of the sugar complex occurred over time, with a variety of models. The dependencies of the farm included a Casa Grande where the owner of the farm lived with his family, and the senzala, where the slaves were kept. A notable early study of this complex is by Brazilian sociologist Gilberto Freire. This arrangement was depicted in engravings and paintings by Franz Post as a feature of an apparently harmonious society. Initially, the Portuguese relied on native slaves to work on sugarcane harvesting and processing, but they soon began importing black African slaves. Portugal owned several commercial facilities in Western Africa, where slaves were bought from African merchants. These slaves were then sent by ship to Brazil, chained and in crowded conditions. The idea of using African slaves in colonial farms based on monoculture was also adopted by other European colonial powers when colonizing tropical regions of America. The Portuguese attempted to severely restrict colonial trade, meaning that Brazil was only allowed to export and import goods from Portugal and other Portuguese colonies. Brazil exported sugar, tobacco, cotton, and native products, and imported from Portugal wine, olive oil, textiles, and luxury goods, the latter imported by Portugal from other European countries. Africa played an essential role as the supplier of slaves, and Brazilian slave traders in Africa frequently exchanged cachaça, a distilled spirit derived from sugarcane, and shells for slaves. This comprised what is now known as the triangular trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas during the colonial period. Merchants during the Sugar Age were crucial to the economic development of the colony. The link between the sugar production areas, coastal Portuguese cities, and Europe. Merchants in the early came from many nations, including Germans, Flemings, and Italians, but Portuguese merchants came to dominate the trade in Brazil. During the union of the Spanish and Portuguese crowns, to be active in Spanish America as well, especially trading African slaves. Even though Brazilian sugar was reputed as being of high quality, the industry faced a crisis during the 17th and 18th centuries when the Dutch and the French started producing sugar in the Antilles, located much closer to Europe, causing sugar prices to fall. The Iberian Union 1580 to 1640. In 1580, a succession crisis led to the union of Portugal and Spain being ruled by the Habsburg King Philip II. The unification of the crowns of the two Iberian kingdoms, known as the Iberian Union, lasted until 1640 when the Portuguese revolted. During the union, the institutions of both kingdoms remained separate. For Portuguese merchants, many of whom were Christian converts from Judaism of the descendants, the union of crowns presented commercial opportunities in the slave trade to Spanish America. The Netherlands obtained independence from Spain in 1581, leading Philip II to prohibit commerce with Dutch ships, including in Brazil. Since the Dutch had invested large sums in financing sugar production in the Brazilian northeast and were important as shippers of sugar, a conflict began with Dutch privateers plundering the coast. They sacked Salvador in 1604, from which they removed large amounts of gold and silver before a joint Spanish-Portuguese fleet recaptured the town. The Dutch in Brazil, 1630 to 1654. From 1630 to 1654, the Dutch set up more permanently in commercial Recife and aristocratic Olinda. With the capture of Paraíba in 1635, the Dutch controlled a long stretch of the coast most accessible to Europe, without, however, penetrating the interior. The large Dutch ships were unable to moor in the coastal inlets where lighter Portuguese shipping came and went. Ironically, the result of the Dutch capture of the sugar coast was a higher price of sugar in Amsterdam. During the NIEUW Holland episode, the colonists of the Dutch West India Company in Brazil were in a constant state of siege. In spite of the presence of the Count John Maurice of Nassau as governor in Recife, Nassau invited scientific commissions to research the local flora and fauna, resulting in added knowledge of the territory. Moreover, he set up a city project for Recife and Olinda, which was partially accomplished. Remnants survive into the modern era. After several years of open warfare, the Dutch finally withdrew in 1654. The Portuguese paid off a war debt in payments of salt. Few Dutch cultural and ethnic influences remain, but Albert Eckart's paintings of indigenous and black Brazilians, as well as his still lifes, are important works of Baroque art. Runaway slave settlements work on the sugarcane plantations in northeast Brazil and other areas relied heavily on slave labor, mostly of Central African origin. One type of resistance to slavery was flight, and with the dense vegetation of the tropics, runaway slaves fled in numbers and for slave owners. This was an endemic problem. Since the early 17th century, there are indications of runaway slaves organizing themselves into settlements in the Brazilian hinterland. These settlements, called mocambos and quilombos, were usually small and relatively close to sugar fields, and attracted not only African slaves but also people of indigenous origin. The largest of the quilombos was the Quilombo dos Palmares, located in today's Alagoas state, which grew to many thousands during the disruption of Portuguese rule with the Dutch incursion. Palmares was governed by leaders Zumba and his successor, Zumbi. The terminology for the settlements and leaders come directly from Angola, with Quilombo a Angolan word for military villages of diverse settlers, and the Nama Zumbi was the priest responsible for the spiritual defense of the community. The Dutch and later the Portuguese attempted several times to conquer Palmares, until an army led by famed São Paulo-born Domingos Jorge Velho managed to destroy the Great Quilombo and kill Zumbi in 1695. Brazilian feature film director Carlos Diegues made a film about Palmares called simply Quilombo. Of the many Quilombos that once existed in Brazil, some have survived to this day as isolated rural communities. Inland expansion, the Entradas and Bandeiras. Since the 16th century, the exploration of the Brazilian inland was attempted several times, mostly to try to find mineral riches like the silver mines found in 1546 by the Spanish in Potosi. Since no riches were initially found, colonization was restricted to the coast where the climate and soil were suitable for sugarcane plantations. The expeditions to inland Brazil are divided into two types, the Entradas and the Bandeiras. The Entradas were done in the name of the Portuguese crown and were financed by the colonial government. Its main objective was to find mineral riches, as well as to explore and chart unknown territory. The Bandeiras, on the other hand, were private initiatives sponsored and carried out mostly by settlers of the São Paulo region. The expeditions of the Bandeirantes, as these adventurers were called, were aimed at obtaining native slaves for trade and finding mineral riches. The Paulistas, who at the time were mostly of mixed Portuguese and native ancestry, knew all the old indigenous pathways through the Brazilian inland and were acclimated to the harsh conditions of these journeys. At the end of the 17th century, the Bandeirantes expeditions discovered gold in central Brazil, in the region of Minas Gerais, which started a gold rush that led to a dramatic urban development of inland Brazil during the 18th century. Additionally, inland expeditions led to westward expansion of the frontiers of colonial Brazil, beyond the limits established by the Treaty of Tordesillas.